Imagine waking up and discovering that one of your closest allies has just put a 50% tax on billions of dollars worth of goods from your country. Then imagine responding, "Fine, we'll tax yours too." That is essentially what happened between the United States and Canada this morning. After days of intense negotiations and claims that a deal was close, the talks collapsed. The United States imposed 50% tariffs on around $20 billion worth of Canadian products. Canada immediately promised to retaliate dollar for dollar. These aren't geopolitical enemies. They share the world's longest international border. Their factories build products together. Their energy systems are connected. Their militaries are allies. So how did America and Canada end up in a tariff war? And could consumers on both sides of the border end up paying for it? Welcome to Global Brief Daily. Let's break it down. For several days, things appeared to be moving in exactly the opposite direction. President Donald Trump had originally scheduled the new tariffs to begin earlier this week. Then he delayed them for 3 days. Why? Because Washington and Ottawa appeared close to reaching an agreement. Trump even said the two countries had a deal, subject to finalizing the documents. Canadian officials were more cautious. They said negotiations were progressing, but important details remained unresolved. Then came Friday night. The negotiations broke down. The United States blamed Canada for refusing to finalize terms Washington believed had already been agreed. Canada gave a different account. Prime Minister Mark Carney said Washington had introduced last-minute changes that Canada considered unfair and economically unacceptable. Carney suspended negotiations and ordered his team back to Ottawa. Then, shortly after midnight Eastern Time on Saturday, the American tariffs took effect, and Canada promised retaliation, not symbolic retaliation. Carney says Canada will respond dollar for dollar. That means North America's trade dispute has moved from negotiation into implementation. The new American duties cover around $20 billion of Canadian exports. They include hundreds of products. Among them are plywood and other wood products, electrical equipment, consumer goods, some food and agricultural products, liquor, and, in one especially Canadian detail, hockey equipment. A 50% tariff is enormous. Suppose an American importer previously paid $1,000 for a shipment of a tariffed Canadian product. A 50% tariff could add $500 at the border. The Canadian company does not simply write a check to Washington. The tariff is collected from the U.S. importer. That importer then has choices. Absorb the cost, demand a lower price from the Canadian supplier, or pass some or all of the cost to customers. And that is why tariffs can eventually show up in consumer prices. But there is important context. These new tariffs affect about 5% of Canada's exports to the United States, according to Reuters and AP. So this is not a 50% tariff on everything Canada sells America. That distinction matters. But for the industries inside that 5%, the impact could be brutal. Washington has several complaints. The Trump administration argues that Canada discriminates against American products. One dispute involves dairy. Canada operates a supply management system that controls production and imports for products including milk, cheese, and poultry. American officials have long argued that aspects of this system restrict U.S. access to the Canadian market. Another dispute involves automobiles. Canada previously imposed retaliatory tariffs on certain American vehicles. And then there is alcohol. Several Canadian provinces restricted or removed American wines and spirits. Trump's administration argues that these policies unfairly disadvantage U.S. companies. Washington therefore used a rarely discussed provision of American law, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. It allows a president to impose duties against a country accused of discriminating against American commerce. AP describes this as the first known use of the provision for tariffs. That's significant. A law sitting quietly on the shelf for nearly a century has suddenly become a major weapon in modern trade policy. Ottawa sees the dispute very differently. Canada argues that it has already made compromises and that the two economies are governed by trade agreements negotiated and signed by both countries. The most important is the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In Canada, it is usually called CUSMA. It replaced NAFTA and was signed during Trump's first presidency. The agreement was designed specifically to provide predictable rules. Canada's concern is straightforward. If Washington can repeatedly add new tariffs outside that framework whenever another dispute emerges, how predictable is the agreement? Carney says the latest American demands went beyond what Canada could accept. Ottawa is now signaling that it intends to defend Canadian industries rather than simply concede to avoid tariffs. So both governments are framing themselves as the party defending fair trade. Washington says Canada discriminates against American businesses. Ottawa says Washington is changing the rules. And that disagreement is at the heart of today's breakdown. Here is what makes a US-Canada trade war unusual. These aren't two distant economies simply exchanging finished products. Their manufacturing systems are deeply integrated. Take a vehicle. A component may be designed in the United States, produced in Canada, sent back to America for assembly, combined with components from Mexico, and ultimately sold somewhere else. Some parts can cross borders multiple times before the finished vehicle reaches a customer. The same interconnectedness exists in energy, agriculture, forestry, machinery, aerospace, critical minerals, and electricity. Trade between the United States and Canada runs into hundreds of billions of dollars every year. Canada is one of America's largest trading partners. The United States is overwhelmingly Canada's most important export market. That creates something economists often describe as economic integration. It also creates vulnerability. When you put tariffs into an integrated supply chain, you aren't necessarily taxing a foreign competitor sitting thousands of kilometers away. Sometimes you're increasing the cost of a component your own factory needs next Tuesday. And that's where the trade war can become a boomerang. Who actually pays? This is one of the most misunderstood parts of tariff politics. Politicians often speak about tariffs as if the exporting country simply pays America money. Mechanically, that's not how customs duties work. The American importer pays the tariff to the U.S. government. What happens afterward depends on bargaining power. A Canadian manufacturer might lower its price to keep the customer. An American importer might accept lower profits. Or the importer might raise prices. Usually the burden gets distributed. That's why economists debate the precise inflation impact of tariffs. It isn't always one for one, but a 50% duty is large enough to make avoidance difficult. For Canadian companies, the problem is competitiveness. If an American buyer can obtain an equivalent product domestically or from another country without the same tariff, Canadian exporters may lose orders. That can eventually mean reduced production, investment cuts, or job losses for American companies dependent on specialized Canadian inputs. However, switching suppliers may be difficult. They may simply end up paying more, so both countries can suffer simultaneously. Trade wars don't always produce a clean winner and loser. Sometimes they produce two bruised neighbors arguing over the repair bill. Now comes Canada's response. Carney says Ottawa will match Washington's tariffs, dollar for dollar. That creates a second layer of economic pressure. Canada can deliberately choose American products produced in politically sensitive states or industries. Agricultural goods, manufactured products, consumer products, potentially other categories. Canadian provincial governments also have leverage because some control alcohol distribution and government procurement. And Canadian officials have previously discussed much more aggressive possibilities involving strategically important exports. Canada supplies the United States with energy and critical materials. Using those as retaliation would represent a far more dramatic escalation, and Ottawa has not announced such a step today. But the fact those options exist matters. The United States is much larger economically. Canada, therefore, cannot win a simple contest of economic size. Its leverage comes from how deeply the two economies depend on each other. Then there's Mexico. There is another player watching all of this carefully, Mexico. The United States, Canada, and Mexico are supposed to be managing North American trade through USMCA, and the agreement itself is entering a sensitive period of review and renegotiation. Mexico's economy minister said Friday that Mexico expected elements of its own discussions with Washington to resemble what had been emerging between the United States and Canada. Then the Canadian deal collapsed. That matters. Mexico now has to ask, if Ottawa and Washington could get extremely close to an agreement and still end up with 50% tariffs, what guarantees does Mexico need before signing anything? So this dispute could reshape negotiations involving the entire North American economic bloc. And companies making long-term investment decisions hate one thing more than almost anything else: uncertainty. A factory can adapt to a 10% tariff. It can adapt to 0 tariffs. What is much harder is planning a billion-dollar investment when nobody knows what the tariff will be next month. What happens next? There are 4 things to watch. First, Canada's retaliation. We need to see exactly which American goods Ottawa targets and when those tariffs take effect. Second, whether negotiations restart. Neither economy benefits from permanent 50% duties. That creates enormous pressure from businesses, workers, and regional governments to reopen talks. Third, escalation. American officials have indicated Washington could consider additional steps if Canada retaliates. That creates the classic trade war cycle. Country A imposes tariffs. Country B retaliates. Country A retaliates against the retaliation. And suddenly, measures that originally covered $20 billion expand much further. Fourth, USMCA itself. This may be the most important long-term question. If today's confrontation poisons the larger trade relationship, North America's economic architecture could be rewritten. That would matter not only to Canada and America, it would matter to Mexico, global manufacturers, energy companies, automakers, and investors deciding where to put factories for the next 20 years. The extraordinary part of this story isn't simply the number, 50%. It's who is imposing it on whom. America and Canada have spent generations building one of the deepest economic relationships on Earth. Their border isn't just a line separating 2 economies. In many industries, it connects one enormous production system. Today, Washington has placed a new barrier inside that system. Ottawa says it will respond with an equal barrier of its own. Maybe this confrontation forces both governments back to the negotiating table. Maybe the tariffs become bargaining chips and disappear. But if retaliation produces more retaliation, the stakes become much bigger than hockey sticks, plywood, or bottles of Canadian whiskey. The question becomes whether North America is moving away from the economic integration that defined the past 3 decades, and whether consumers, workers, and companies on both sides of the border will be asked to pay for that change. 2 allies, 1 border, 50% tariffs, and for now, no deal. This is Global Brief News, beyond the headlines.